Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome to this video. Today we are going to take an app that is written using straight up component state, like set state and all that stuff you're used to. And we're going to convert it to use the new context API that just came out with React 16.3. So just quickly to show what the app is, it's a pretty simple photo gallery where it's pulling the pictures from Unsplash API. You can search for whatever you want, some llamas here. And we're going to take this code and I'll show you how to go through the whole process of converting it to use context API. All right, so let's get started. All right, right at the top is where we render our app into our DOM, our root element right here. So let's go take a look at the app. And this is sort of what I would say is the top level component in the component tree of this application. And I'm going to talk about component trees a lot because in React, you typically want state to live as high as it can in the application so that it can be used all the way throughout your whole application. But one annoying thing that comes out of that is, say you've got your state up here in the app and you want to use it 5 levels deep. Well, now you have to pass it as a prop from here to the 4th level, 3rd level, 2nd level, 1st level, etc., all the way till you can actually use it. And then what happens if you want to have a function which modifies the state? You also need that to live up here in the app, and you can pass that down as well. And that's a pain. So people often reach right away for using a state management library like MobX or Redux. And here's an alternative. And just as like a word of caution, I wouldn't straight away think that, oh, I no longer need Redux and MobX because they're both great tools. And in my personal opinion, after playing around with React Context a little bit, I would still use one of those libraries instead of reaching right for this right away. And in fact, those libraries happen to use this new context API. But enough talking, let's get to it. So right now we've got app with some state. We've got a function which makes an AJAX call and modifies the state. So we got our set state here when we're starting searching, another one when we're done and we have the images we want to display, and a third one when there's an error and we want to change the status to error. So now down here in the render, we can extract the different things from the state, the different properties, the term, the status, and the images, and use those here in the render. But what we're also doing is passing the fetch images function down to the form. Because in the form is where the user will type the thing they want to search for, and on submit will handle this here, which will call the function which was passed down from its parent, the app, which is where the state actually lives. And that's because you can't change a parent's state other than through the functions that it provides to you that you can call, and basically you're not changing the state. You're calling a function which comes from the parent, and it's the one that actually changes the state. So you have that trickle down effect of state lives at the top and it needs to get passed all the way down, and same with functions that can modify the state need to come down from the top. So it's a pretty simple app, so we don't really run into the issue too much of having to pass it down many levels. We've just got the form, and we've got down here we map the images and render each one into an image tag. So it's not going to help us that much in this application, but it's small enough that you'll sort of be able to see the whole package and how it fits together. So let's start converting this. What I'm going to do is create a new folder called contexts. And here's where I'm going to put, in our case, we'll just have one single context, but maybe you've got a more complicated application and you need to have multiple contexts. So this might be similar in MobX, you can have multiple stores. In Redux, you can combine different reducers together to manage more complicated apps. You can do the same with React Context API. You can have multiple. So in here, we'll create a new file and we'll call it gallery context.jsx. Why not? Okay. So in here, we're going to import React from React. And then the first thing I'm going to do is create a context. And we'll talk about what that is in a second. So we'll say const gallery context, gallery context equals react.create context. And I'm actually just going to make sure I am using, oh, I'm not. So this wouldn't even work, which is why it wasn't recommending that to me. So let's update this so that we can actually do this thing, no? So 16.3 here, 16.3 here. We'll just stop our app. We'll yarn install. Hopefully it won't take too long. And once we have 16.3, we'll have access to this new API, and then we can just start that again. And just let's make sure it works first. Okay, looks like it's still good. So we come back here, and now when I do, well, still not recommending it, but hopefully it will work. So I've got this variable called React or gallery context. And what I'm actually going to do is export this like so. So what is a context? A context is made up of two things, a provider and a consumer. And basically, you're going to have a single provider, and it's going to live as close to the top as possible. And then you can have multiple consumers. And what they basically allow you to do is, further down in the component tree, you can reach way up to the top and grab anything from the provider. So that avoids you passing things 5 levels down. Sort of at the 5th level down, you can just reach up and grab what you want to from the top. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a provider. So I'll just export class gallery provider, and this is actually just going to be a straight up component. So as whatever you're used to with components, so it can have state and a render function and all of that stuff. And what we're going to do in this render here is we are going to return gallery context dot provider. Okay. And inside of here, we are going to render this dot props dot children. Okay, so what we've done is we've used our context to grab its provider, and inside of the provider we'll render the children. So the one prop you have to provide to a provider is a value. And this is the sort of value or variable that the consumer has access to, nothing else. So what I actually want to do is I want it to be an object so that it can store sort of multiple properties of my state, and also the functions that I want to be able to pass down to the consumers so that they can modify the state. So before I get there, I'm actually going to go back to app, and I'm going to start removing things out of the app and moving it into my gallery provider. So we'll take the state out of here, and we'll come in and we'll put it in this gallery provider here. And now the value I can do here will be a copy of the state. So this dot state. Okay, so now any of these state properties are going to be available to an eventual consumer of this provider. Next thing I want to do is go and grab that function, fetch images. So I'm just going to copy this whole thing out of here and move it over to the provider, like so. So now I can also pass this function down to anyone who wants to consume this. So we can just say fetch images like that. And this should, actually, no, that won't work. So we'll do fetch images is this dot fetch images. There, that should work. So just to get this working, it's using an unsplash function to do the actual API call. So we need to go bring that over from our app as well. So I cut it from here and bring that over, and we'll do this. So I go up a level, so now I'm in the source and I can go down into services, so that should be fine. Okay, so I'm getting an error, but that's to be expected at this point. We're going to be fixing that eventually. Okay. So now that we've created our context and exported it, and we've also exported this gallery provider component, which down in here basically returns the context provider with some value and our children. Now we can start to use this. So as I said, you typically want your gallery provider or your provider in general to live as far to the top as possible so that any of its children can reach up and access the value that it has passed here as a prop. So let's go to our index, and this is the top as you can get. It's rendering the app directly into the DOM. So here we will import our gallery provider from, where is it in? It's in contexts, gallery context, like that. And then we'll wrap this provider around our app. Like so. So we still got the same error because we haven't fixed that yet. But let's now create our first consumer. So we've wrapped our gallery provider around the app. So this is the thing that gets passed as the children. If you remember back here, in here we're rendering the children. So this is the app. But what we're going to do is basically use our first consumer. So not only from here, but I can, do I want to import the gallery provider, but I also want to import the gallery context. And what I can do is wrap gallery context.consumer around the app. Okay. Now you may think it would work like this, but we're missing one thing. The child of a consumer isn't actually a component, but it's a render prop essentially. It's a function. So we're going to embed a function here, and we'll return the app like that. So what gets passed to the parentheses as the arguments of this function here is the value that came from our provider. So if you come back here and you remember this value, it's a copy of the state. So we have access to term, images, and status. And we also have access to a function, fetch images. So any of those things we can extract from the value and pass along to our app. So using ES6 destructuring, we can access all the things we need to pass on to our app. And if we look at our app, I'm pretty sure we need everything. In component did mount, we want to do fetch images here as soon as the app mounts. And we also need the other things so that it can work correctly. So we'll pass those all down. So term, status, images, and fetch images function we're going to get. And all of those need to be passed on to the app. Now at this point you're saying, well, if you're passing absolutely everything, why don't you just call it value and then sort of do a ... value here so you can pass everything from it to the app? I like to avoid that because if I add new properties to this state or new functions in the future that the app doesn't need, I'm now passing them just sort of by nature of doing the ... it takes everything. And I don't want to do that. So I'm going to be explicit and pass the term and the status and the images and the fetch images function. Like that. So we still have the same error, and that's because we were grabbing all of these things from the state before. But now they're not coming from the state. They're coming from as props. from the value given to us from the consumer, which was taken from the provider. So we just need to modify our app component to use props instead of state directly. So we'll go in here, and this is now props.fetchImages, and these all come from the props. And we're working again. So we've done a simple conversion of this app to use the new React Context API. But I think we can improve it a little bit more. We can break all of these out and have them get the values directly from or via a consumer, instead of me again sort of passing them from the top all the way down, which is what the React Context is supposed to solve, sort of dependency injection from the top at any stage in our component tree. So let's start breaking these out into smaller components that each have their own consumer and they're fetching what they need from it. Why don't we start with the form? We're going to create a folder called form, and in it we'll create an index.js file. And I'll show you why I like to do it this way in a minute. So at this point, all I'm going to do is import form from form, which doesn't exist yet, but we'll have it there in a second, and export default form. So now I'm going to just move this form into this folder so that it works. So I could have just taken all of this form component here and put it directly in the index file, but I'll show you why I didn't do that and why I like to do it this way instead. And that's because I'm going to use this index file as a place where I can essentially connect a consumer to the form component. So think of it in MobX like this is the place where you'd inject your store into your component, or in Redux where you'd connect your Redux store to your component. Here we're using our consumer and connecting it to our component. So what we're going to do is import our gallery context from, we'll go another level to get the contexts and gallery context. So it's a little bit of a pain to get that, but so now we can use this to grab the consumer and wrap it around the form. So when I started playing around with this, the mistake I made was, okay, why don't I just wrap it around like so. And if you remember, it needs to take a function in here. So we'll pass a function and it will return our form like so. And then we'll close our gallery context. Sorry, .consumer. I'm missing that on the opening tag as well. Consumer. Okay. So I've wrapped the context consumer around. It receives this little render prop function as a child, and it can receive any of the value and pass that onto the form. So let me do that. So what we're going to extract from here is the fetch images function, and I can pass that along to the form component like that. And I think the only thing I'm missing is React. Okay. So if I load this, I'm getting an error. What's this? Components formed. Oh yeah. Form. I'm going to restart this. Hopefully it will fix itself. All right. So this error was driving me crazy for a long time. I didn't understand it. Element type is invalid. It expected a string or a class function, but got an object. So I was like, what is this object and why is it giving me this error? And I couldn't figure out what was wrong with this code for the longest time. I'm using consumer right. I'm passing a render prop function here, it's receiving everything and it's working fine. The issue was I shouldn't have been exporting this, which is in essence an object, this consumer object. And instead what I should have been exporting is a function which returns that. So as soon as I did that, things started working again. And then I thought of one other way to sort of improve this, and is, okay, well, now that I'm wrapping this code here in a function, what if I wanted to, so I no longer need to pass this anymore because it's now getting it right from the consumer, so it still works. But what if I wanted to pass another prop? Something equals true. Because this prop is being passed not directly to the form, but to this functional component right here, what I needed to do is accept the props that are being passed to it and then pass them on to this form below. Props, like that. So pass along any props just so that they can arrive to where they need to go, which is the form itself. So what we essentially created here is a higher order component that is taking our regular old form and it's enhancing it by wrapping a consumer around it, which gives it access to any of the properties of the provider's value. So in this case, we're just grabbing the fetch images function and passing that along to our form. So now, if I were to inspect this in the React inspector, so I've got app, which is passing something equals true to this functional component here. It doesn't have a name, that's why it's called unknown. But you can see that now it's also continuing this prop something equals true onto the form. And here we can see that we're also passing our fetch images function, which came to us via the context consumer. So let's just go back here and we don't have to pass something true anymore. Okay, so there's two reasons why I like this structure of our component. And that's because it sort of packages things up together in this form component folder. And it would allow me to sort of say I had styled components, I could put them in here, and they're styled components specifically for the form component. I could write tests for the form component and put them in this folder too. And it sort of encapsulates everything really nicely in this form folder. And the reason I'm sticking this sort of enhancement or higher order component in the index and not adding it directly into this form itself is because now if I want to write tests for this form, I don't have to worry at all about what context it lives in. Because all this thing cares about is that it's receiving the correct props, which in this case is the fetch images function. So I can write a test for this and pass it a bogus fetch images function, maybe like a spy function to make sure it's being called correctly. And I don't even need to think about context because that lives in a different place. It allows isolation. All right, so we're just going to create a couple more of these to clean up our app a little bit more. So we'll create a new folder called status. And we'll do the same thing. So you're going to get really used to this. So we're going to import React from React. We're going to import a status component, which we haven't created yet. And then we're going to import our gallery context from contexts gallery context. Cool. So just before I move on, I'm going to create the actual status component. So I'll import React from React. And then why don't we just make this one a functional component instead of a full-on class-based component. So we can export default an arrow function, and then we'll come up here and rip all of this code that has to do with status outside of the app and move it over into here. And I've got an issue is because these are siblings with no parent. So the old way was to use a div or something and wrap it around, even though the div did nothing, you'd have it there because you can't have siblings beside each other without a parent. So all we do now is we can use the new fragment tag, which doesn't do anything visually, but allows you to return these different statuses and not run into the error of you can only export a single component. So now that we've got this status fine, let's see what it needs to receive. It needs to receive the status, the term, and the images. So we can assume we're going to receive these as props. So status, term, and images. And now we just need to go write our consumer so that it passes us the correct thing from the provider. So we'll come back here and we'll export default an arrow function, which will receive any props and pass them on to the status. So here we're going to use our gallery context again, .consumer. And inside of here, we embed a function which will render our status component. So we'll just set it up like this for now. So what this thing needs to receive are all the props which were given to us in this as this argument here. And then we need to extract, the term, the status, and the images from the provider's value. And then we can pass those along to the status component. So term equals term, status equals status, and images equals images. Okay, so now we're passing all the proper things to our status component, and we just need to update our app to use this new status component instead. So we'll just say status there, and we'll include it here. And let's just make sure it's working. If I do llamas for like a split second, you'll see that it's searching. Or if I find something that it can't find, it will tell me a nice message that it can't find. Cool. So the last thing we're going to fix is we'll do this images so we can use the consumer instead of having to access it and pass it down directly from the app. So we're going to create one new component called images. So we'll have a folder for it. You know the drill now. We have an index which imports, you know what, just so that I don't have to type it all again. Okay, so we have React. We have our images component which we are going to create. We need to pass on just the images, and then we will pass those and the props to this images component which doesn't exist yet. Cool, so I think that's it. We just need to create an images component, import React from React, and we will export default, which will receive images as a prop, and it will return, you know what, we'll come back here to app, and we can just cut this code here that we were using up here. Cool, so now it's receiving the images which now come from the consumer via the provider, from the provider via the consumer, and they'll be passed one by one to the image component, which we need to import as well. Cool. So now the only thing I need to do to make this work is move this image component into the images folder, and then go up and modify the app so that it uses the new images component which we've created. So we'll just change here. Okay. So now we've cleaned up our app quite a bit using the new context API. Whereas before the app was this massive thing, it's now quite small. And the truth is that we no longer need any of these things because they're being grabbed directly by these components. So the only thing we need to pass is the fetch images function so that it can fetch some mountains the first time this thing loads. So we'll go back up to our index and just clean it up because we no longer have to pass those things. Just like that. And we can clean them up from here as well. Perfect. So everything's working again. We could clean it up further and just basically get rid of this consumer by doing the initial fetch of the mountains right inside of our gallery context. Why don't we do that just for fun? So component did mount, and we'll just call fetch images. This time we'll maybe get some cows. And because that's being done here now, we can go and remove it from the app. And we can avoid wrapping the app in a consumer because it's no longer needed. And it doesn't need to receive anything either. So app, just like that. And we wouldn't need this either. So let's see it works. And it does. So when the gallery provider mounts, it will go fetch some cows. And now the app doesn't need to be wrapped by a consumer because it's not really consuming anything directly from the provider. And it's really clean. We could actually clean it up further by converting this component, which no longer needs to be a class-based component. So what we could just do here is export default like that. So now it's just a functional component that returns these other components inside of it, and it's still working. Guinea pig, just to make sure it's working. So there we go. So there's some cute guinea pig. Okay, just to review everything we did today, what we did was took our app, which used to be massive. This is where the state used to live. And this is where the logic used to live, like the fetch images function. And you used to have to pass everything down directly from the top all the way down the component tree to the last component that needed either the property from the state or one of the functions that modified the state. Because as I mentioned before, a child can't directly modify the state of its parent. It can only do so through a function that the parent provides to it. So what we did is we ripped all of that out and we have it living in the provider as well. So what is a provider? Just to review that. We first have a context. So we use the new react.createContext function, which returns to us this thing called and I've called it a gallery context. But what this gives us is access to a provider and a consumer. So a provider is something that you need to give a value to. And then anytime inside of any of its children, so anywhere down the component tree, you can use this context consumer to grab this value from the provider. And what I've done is I've simply wrapped this provider in a component that I've sort of given the same name, just gallery provider. So now I'm having all my state live here. My initial component did mount stuff, and my function which modifies the state. All of this lives up here. And we've provided all of this to the value object that can then be grabbed by any of the consumers. So we've created 3 different consumers in this case. Our form has a consumer. And what this consumer does is it has a render prop function as a child in here. And as its arguments, it receives the value. So we can use ES6 destructuring to grab what we want from this value and pass it along to our actual component. So now in our actual component, literally nothing has changed. It still just receives a prop, which is a function, and it can call it, or it could receive values that it needs to, but it cleans it up a lot to have it organized in this way. And then we just refactored a little bit by creating our images component and creating our status component so that we could move all of that logic outside of our app. And that's it for the new context API. I hope you enjoyed learning about it. As I mentioned before, I recommend highly don't reach for this right away instead of using MobX and Redux. Those are two libraries which they specialize in managing your state, and they have a lot of nice functionality that doesn't come with this context API. Really what a context API is, it's just a way to inject stuff, dependency injection, from a top level into another level. So this is actually used by, as I mentioned, MobX and Redux themselves, but it's a tool for you to use it. If not, I would say just happily keep on using MobX or Redux. Thanks, have a good day. Bye.